Hello, and welcome to Lunchtime with the Irish Peatland Conservation Council. This is the first in a series of talks that will explore various aspects of peatland habitat in Ireland. Over the coming series, we're going to be exploring peatland habitats, their formation, biodiversity, ecosystem services, and management and restoration of Irish peatlands. These talks are brought to you with funding support from the Community Foundation for Ireland, and we're going virtual with support from the Irish Environmental Network. So, who are the Irish Peatland Conservation Council? Well, we're a national charity in Ireland, and our mission is to conserve a representative sample of Irish peatlands for people to enjoy today and in the future. We're based at the Bogavana Nature Centre in County Kildare. We own and manage in partnership 5 peatland nature reserves nationally: Lodge Bog and Lullymore West Bog in County Kildare, in partnership with the Moyne Funorak Development Association, Fenner Bog in County Waterford. We own 8.5 hectares of Gurley Bog, and together with other stakeholders and landowners, this is a protected 100-hectare natural heritage area. And we also own Blanket Bog, Code Bog in County Kerry. Our work includes peatland site conservation, species monitoring, peatland policy, research and education and awareness. The Save the Bogs campaign is guided by peatland conservation action plans. The charity have developed 7 since our foundation in 1982. The latest conservation action plan is called Peatlands and Climate Change 2030, and this should be read in conjunction with the Peatlands and Conservation Action Plan 2020, halting the loss of peatland biodiversity. You can learn more about the work of the Irish Peatland Conservation Council and, of course, Irish peatland habitats, and how you can get involved by visiting our website www.ipcc.ie. So what is a peatland? Well, peatlands are also referred to as bogs, and they're wetlands. They contain 90% water and 10% dead and decaying plants. They once covered an area of over 1 million hectares on the island of Ireland. They're acidic in nature. Peat is the result of the accumulation of partially decayed plants over thousands of years. The dead plants don't decompose because they grow in waterlogged conditions where there is little oxygen, and this prevents the agents of decay, bacteria and fungi, from working. As a result of this limited oxygen and the prevention of bacteria and fungi from working, it means peatlands are extremely nutrient poor habitats. As a result, all of the peatland plants are very low growing, and this means that our peatland habitats are wide and open landscapes. Healthy peatlands have a water table within 20 centimetres of the surface throughout the year, and sphagnum moss is the main peat-forming plant, growing 1 millimetre a year and storing 20 times its own weight in water. In Ireland, our peatland types are classified according to Fawcett. Today, we're going to focus on 3 different peatland types: their formation, where you might find them in Ireland, and their current conservation status. These include fen habitats, raised bog habitats, and blanket bog habitats, which are divided into both Atlantic and upland or mountain blanket bog. So, what is a fen? Well, a fen is a wetland with a permanently high water table at or just below the surface. Its principal source of nutrients is from surface or groundwater, and the substrate is alkaline to acidic in nature. The vegetation is usually dominated by sedges. They started to form 10,000 years ago in shallow lakes or wet depressions in the landscape that were created at the end of the last ice age. If we have a look at the images on the left, look at the top images. These lakes were created, as I mentioned, at the end of the last ice age. Naturally, over time, wetland plants, including those that float, those that are submerged beneath the water surface, and those that are emergent at the edges, began to colonize these lakes. Over time, as these plants multiplied and their leaf litter settled at the bottom of these lakes, it would take about 3,000 years, but these lakes eventually infilled with plant material. And this created our fens 7,000 years ago. A fen is a lake infilled with dead plant material, typically 98% water and 2% dead plant material. They're alkaline in nature because they're still in contact with groundwater. Fen habitats can be subdivided into 2 broad categories: the topogenous fens and the sologenous fens. These indeed are then subdivided into a further 3 types each. Topogenous fens forms within basins in the landscape where the water fluctuations are in a vertical direction. Water accumulates on account of the topography. Solid genus fens are formed where sloping terrain provides a continuous supply of flowing water. The horizontal movement of water is more important than the vertical movement of water. This image is of Pollardstown Fen in County Kildare. It's protected as a special area of conservation in Ireland, and it's also an internationally recognised Ramsar site. So where might you find fen habitat? Well, they're typically found in limestone-rich areas, most commonly in the West and Midlands of Ireland. The original extent of fens in the Republic of Ireland was over 92,000 hectares. Impact of man has had caused serious effects on our fen habitats. These include reclamation for agricultural land. This involved drainage, fertilisation, reclamation, and the removal of peat. Today in Ireland, 99 fen sites are conserved as special areas of conservation, that is SAC, and natural heritage areas, NHA, within 8,200 hectares. This represents just under 9% of the original habitat area. I should mention here, a special area of conservation is a designation under the European Union Habitats Directive. A natural heritage area, or an NHA, is a designation under Irish law, under the Wildlife Act. So let's move on to raised bogs. Well, raised bogs are dome-shaped. They're masses of acidic peat, and they occupy former lakes or shallow depressions in the landscape. They can be up to 12 metres deep, and they occur throughout the Midlands of Ireland. Their principal supply of water is from rainfall. Raised bogs are characterised by low-growing, open vegetation dominated by mosses, sedges and heathers, all of which are adapted to the waterlogged, acidic and exposed conditions. So how do they form? Well, if you remember, our fen habitats formed 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. And this is also the beginning of our raised bog formation, because 10,000 years ago, shallow lakes were created in our landscape. Naturally, as I mentioned, with our fen habitats, they began to infill. Wetland plants, those that float, those that are emergent, and those that are submerged, began to colonize these lakes. And it would take 3,000 years, but these lakes would continue their growth into a fen habitat, and they were formed 7,000 years ago. While many fens remained as fens because of the continuous supply of alkaline-rich rainwater into them, those shallow lakes that didn't have that original supply of continuing flow of water into them, they continued their growth into raised bogs. 4,000 years ago, most of the island of Ireland was now covered in trees. Naturally, we went through a second climate change. This time we got our temperate climate, wind and rain. The trees that were growing over these very wet habitats could no longer survive, and they simply fell over where they were standing. This allowed a very special moss to grow called sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss is the bog building moss, and it grew upwards, building our raised bogs over the past 10,000 years. If we look at the profile of our raised bogs, we find at the bottom our fen peat, then we find this woodland layer, and on top we have our sphagnum peat. They can be 12 metres deep, and they're acidic in nature because their only supply of water is rainfall. So where might you find raised bogs in Ireland? Well, looking at this map of Ireland here on your right, raised bogs are those marked with the cream yellow colour. They're dominant in the Midlands of Ireland and the Lower Bann Valley in Northern Ireland. The original extent of raised bogs in the Republic of Ireland was over 308,000 hectares. However, raised bogs have been affected by humans. Peat extraction for domestic use, generation of electricity, and the peat use in the horticultural industry, as well as drainage and afforestation, have resulted in raised bog habitat loss. Today, 129 raised bog sites are conserved within our special area of conservation. Remember, that's an SAC, a designation under the European Union Habitats Directive, and NHA, or Natural Heritage Area, a designation under Irish law under the Wildlife Act. The 129 raised bogs conserved total an area of over 30,000 hectares throughout the country, and this represents a 10% of the original area protected. Finally, let's look at blanket bogs. And we have two types of blanket bog, Atlantic blanket bog and montane blanket bog. And they're both found in areas where they receive over 1,200 millimetres of rainfall per year. Atlantic blanket bogs are found typically on the west coast from sea level up to an altitude of 200 metres. The acidic peat substrate ranges from 2 to 7 metres deep. Vegetation has a characteristic grassy appearance due to the occurrence of purple moor grasses and black bog brush. Patterned surface of pools, flattened sloped areas, flushes and swallow holes are all important features on blanket bog habitat. Montane blanket bogs are found above 200 millimeters of altitude, typically very flat terrain. The vegetation is characterized by the presence of heathers, in particular ling heather, crowberry and bilberry. Natural drains, lakes and flushes are features of montane blanket bog. So just to recap, Atlantic blanket bog are found at an altitude up to 200 meters. Montane blanket bog are found at altitudes above 200 meters. So how did blanket bog form? Well, both humans and climate had a role to play in blanket bog formation. These formed, and they were younger than raised bogs and fens because they formed only 4,000 years ago. If we think back, 4,000 years ago, similar to our raised bog formation, most of the island of Ireland is covered in trees. Early settlers began to clear these trees and upland areas where they found good agricultural land beneath. However, our climate was also to change 4,000 years ago. We began to get this temperate climate with increased rainfall and wind. The increased rainfall began to push valuable minerals and leach them through the soil, eventually building up an iron pan layer. This iron pan layer became impermeable to water, and in turn, the agricultural land that was once farmed began to become waterlogged. Over time, it allowed sphagnum mosses to grow. These sphagnum mosses are our bog builders, building our bogs 1 millimetre a year. As I said, blanket bogs are only 4,000 years old, and because they're younger, they typically range in depth between 4 to 6 metres. And beneath the blanket bog, you have this mineral soil. So where might you find blanket bog habitat? Well, montane blanket bog is the most widespread blanket bog habitat, while Atlantic blanket bog is found mainly along the west coast. If we look at the map of Ireland here, blanket bog habitat are highlighted in black. The original extent of blanket bog was over 774,000 hectares, so the most widespread of Ireland's peatland habitats. Loss of blanket bog habitat is a result of peat extraction, domestic fuel, electricity generation, horticulture, drainage, land reclamation, invasive species, overgrazing and afforestation have all impacted on blanket bog habitats. Today, 137 blanket bog habitat sites are conserved within Ireland's SAC and NHA network, covering a total area of over 200,000 hectares of Ireland's uplands throughout the country. That represents 25% of the original area. We must pause here and remember that much of the blanket bog conserved is in upland areas that are difficult to access by humans. So let's have a summary of the three main peatland types in Ireland. Fens are the only alkaline in nature because they're still in contact with groundwater. Both raised bog and blanket bog are typically acidic. Blanket bog are found in upland areas, so they receive up to 1,200 millimetres of rainfall a year, while both fen and raised bog, typically found in the Midlands and the Lower Bann Valley in Northern Ireland for raised bogs, and indeed fens in limestone-rich areas, receive between 800 and 900 millimetres of rainfall. Peat depth, the fen can be up to 2 metres, raised bog up to 12 metres, while blanket bog between 2 and 6 metres. Fens are typically found in flat, and raised bogs are typically domed, while blanket bogs are flat-shaped, sloped and undulating. Both fen and raised bogs started to form in lake basins. Blanket bogs, although some did form in lake basins, they were formed directly on mineral soil. So, I've mentioned today that Irish peatland habitat is protected, a sample of it. However, we also need a lot more work to do. In the Irish Peatland Conservation Council site database, we identify that there is still 19,000 hectares of fen habitat in a conservation-worthy important state. And we need a national fen inventory and an increase in the conservation levels from 8%. Remember, only less than 10% of our fen habitats are protected. They've taken thousands of years to form. We really want to have a representative sample of fen habitats. We first need to assess the condition of our fens in Ireland, and secondly, we need to designate more fens. As I said, Irish Peatland Conservation Council identify 19,000 hectares of fens that are in a conservation worthy state. However, only 8,000 hectares of fen habitat is actually conserved. Peat extraction has resulted in significant peatland habitat loss. If we look, 37% on blanket bog and 86% of raised bog habitat have been directly affected by peat extraction. Although burning of peat is the greatest emitter of greenhouse gases when compared to coal, oil and gas, it is not subject to the same carbon taxes. To help protect our peatlands, peat should be considered as a fossil fuel, and it should, as a result, be subject to the same taxes as other fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas. We need change in this area, both to protect peatlands, but also to protect our climate. Although we've protected 266 raised and blanket bog habitats as special areas of conservation and natural heritage areas, turf cutting activities are still permitted on 177 raised and blanket bogs sites and that are protected under law. While peat extraction continues on sites designated for conservation, peatland habitat continues to be lost. We need to change this. The Irish Peatland Conservation Council's Peatlands and Climate Change Action Plan 2030 and our Peatlands and Biodiversity Action Plan 2020 set out a set of actions. These are just 3 of the actions we're calling on for the effective conservation of a representative sample of Irish peatland habitat in Ireland. In the next Lunchtime with the Irish Peatland Conservation Council, we'll explore why we need to take action, what are the values peatlands offer us all, and we'll have a particular focus on our climate. In the meantime, you can support the work of the Irish Peatland Conservation Council by joining as a friend of the bog. You can do this online on our website or indeed by contacting us via telephone or email. You can get in touch by our website, www.ipcc.ie, email bogs@ipcc.ie, or telephone within Ireland 045 860 133. And in the meantime, don't forget to keep up to date with the work of the Irish Peatland Conservation Council through our social media challenge, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and of course YouTube, where you're watching this video. For now, farewell, and we look forward to for you to join us at the next Lunchtime with the Irish Peatland Conservation Council.